Proportional Response, Book 1, Chapter 13, Part 7, To Live on a Turtle. Eldius sat for a moment and tried to figure out what kick his legs out from under him meant in regards to Vashna trying to chase her nephew. When the human euphemism processed, she threw her head back and laughed, making it a point to push her chest out as she did so. She caught Henry's glance down at what she'd brought his attention to and smiled to herself. Men of both our species, it seems. Then what he'd said, and invited her to, hit her like a brick. It became all she could do to sit there calmly for a moment, but she managed to keep the smile on her face. She finally found her voice.
Very well, I would be glad to accept a dinner with you, and look forward to see if you can cook meat, as well as you can pound it with that wooden sword.
The both laughed, and she rose to go.
I'll give you access to my calendar, and you can set something up when it is convenient for you. There is one condition though.
She deliberately hardened her countenance.
I will not have you disparaging my protégé, nor her intentions, nor me.
Henry sat back almost as if struck, blinking rapidly. He began to make protesting noises. Oh, he is so cute when he is flustered. She cut him off before he could speak.
I have spoken to Vashna at great length about her intentions towards my kin. For you to say that I need to convince you is a little insulting to her, implying that she would mistreat him, and to me for implying that I might let her.
His eyes widened and he held up both hands as if to ward the idea off. Oh, I could pinch those red little cheeks.
So, I will just tell you, Vashna is not sure of her intentions towards Envil and will make that very clear to him as quickly as she is able. To be clear, she is considering a permanent relationship with him, but wants time with him to consider it and wants to keep it light until that point. She has promised that she will do her best to treat him well and not to lead him on.
Henry sat and blinked rapidly again, turning his head this way and that as he processed the information. It only took a moment before he locked eyes with her and spoke.
Very well. I will take your word, and hers, on faith, and speak with him tomorrow. You are right, she is a smart girl, and wise beyond her years.
She gave him a half smile.
Good, we have an accord, and I will look forward to trying more of your human food. Until then.
He smiled and nodded. She winked at him, turned and left, making it a point to sway her hips a little as she opened the door. She could feel his eyes on her ass, and she allowed herself a smile as she left the room with a much more demure walk. Hannibal sat in one of the more out-of-the-way meeting rooms of the human embassy. He could hear the impact of wood on steel coming from outside as the American ambassador Galen finished up his report on his very quiet discussions with the Findle government after... What had happened? He looked around the room at the small group. I like these meetings, and that we are able to have them without arousing suspicion, or at least much suspicion. Having to break the meetings up into multiple short sessions during each practice so as to make it less obvious that people are sneaking away tends to keep things focused as an added bonus. Still, the last session or two we get every practice can start to get a bit ripe. This session included the triple threat of the Duke and his wives, as well as his aunt, her assistant, sitting next to him as always, though today she was playing her distant debonair game, Henry, and the Thamirkan and Arabso ambassadors. He stopped looking around the room and tried to focus on the conclusion of the ambassador's report, rather than the smell or Vashna's hand sitting just short of touching his.
In conclusion, the talks with the Findle government went far better than predicted, though, in retrospect, we should have anticipated what happened. The highest officials of their government have agreed to shift their racist support to humanity, and now consider themselves a client race of the humans, rather than the Zoltan. They are keeping this secret, of course, until current events play out, as they put it.
The announcement met stunned silence. Even Henry seemed to be surprised. Of course, surprised or not, he recovered first.
We thought it would take more convincing than this to get that to happen. Honestly, most of our intel personnel expected them to hold with the Zoltans until the actual war ended.
Galen gave the odd smile of his species, which curved up from the edges of their small beaks.
It appears that someone in their government has the ability to look at the present, not just the past, and has the ability to count. Specifically, the count of victories in engagements between human and Zoltan forces in the brush wars where they have been fought, and the fact that the Zoltan victory count could be lost in a rounding error.
The Duke whistled long and low.
The Findle switching sides. Who would have believed it after all these centuries?
Henry's eyebrows furrowed together, and he looked at Galen.
They are keeping this very secret for now, and watching what they say in front of subordinates, right?
Galen nodded.
Yes, there are under a dozen people in their government currently who know the change is coming. All of them are senior officials capable of holding secrets. If you want to know how good they are at holding secrets, you should look at the appendices my people attached to that report. There are things in there that even your much vaunted human intelligence efforts have not been able to discover. The new ambassador they are sending does not know, of course. Centuries of bowing to the Zoltan can't be worked out of them overnight, and most of their population will continue to work in the support of the Altans until the end of the war. They were quite adamant about that point. Amusingly, they seem to fear Sultan reprisal almost as much as they fear you.
Vashna nodded.
Not without reason. The Sultan have a proven history of genocide, so, of course, they are scared of the Sultan and want to hedge their bets. I suspect what they send over will be helpful in small ways, but they will never send over anything that gives a serious strategic advantage, and never anything that the Sultan even might be able to trace back to any Feindel. This lets them play both sides against the middle. If we, excuse me, you humans and your coalition, since we will be keeping out of it, win the war, then the top brass of the Feindel government have been working with you all along, and they have a new foundation races to protect them. If the Zoltan win, then they get to keep the status quo, and the handful of them who know the reality just have to keep their beaks shut.
Enibel tried to keep his eyes studiously on Henry, but couldn't help glancing her way. She met his glance with a small smirk, which told him he hadn't managed to hide that he felt a little impressed. I wonder if she understands why I am impressed. Most of that is elementary to figure out, but understanding the Findle enough to understand their foundation race concept, few have ever bothered. Balud turned both his eyes on Vashna and twirled the one farthest from her in a gesture meant to indicate curiosity among the Arabso.
Foundation race. I know that the Feindel have always looked to the Zoltan for protection and with something that borders on Slavish worship, but I do not know this foundation race concept.
Vashna smiled and nodded to him, then glanced at Henry as if to ask if he wished to field the question. Reasonable and tactful of her to defer to the host of our meeting when the question was aimed at her. She shifted in her chair slightly as Henry motioned for her to continue. Her hand lightly bumped his, and the contact seemed to send fire up his arm. He glanced down to see a blush on his hands and a matching one on hers. He made a worried glance around to see that no one seemed to have noticed, except his aunt, who smiled and gave him a wink, as if to encourage him. I don't understand why she seems to think we would be a good match. She is just a girl. He considered the blush on his hands and followed the blush on hers up her arm until his eyes got to her. No, not going there. Okay, she has. Blast it, Enibel, she's going to speak. Pay attention. She had not looked at him at all, but pushed her chest out a tiny bit as she pulled in a breath to speak. How did she know? Her voice sounded wise beyond her years.
For most of the Findil's history, they feared to step on land. There was an apex predator on their world, one that they never managed the tools nor the wit to fight. Due to some quirks of how their world is laid out, there is no place on that world which was safe from the things. There were, however, immense air-breathing shell-covered creatures which lived in their oceans. They are called Trilli, and are similar to the Terran tortoise, the Kengano on the Arabso homeworld Inran, or my own world Zweklor, except large enough to build towns, on which they did. Trilli are strange life forms which blur the line between individual organism and colony organism. They do not die of age, just keep getting larger. Their shells have peaks and valleys that grow out as they age, and their ages are measured in the number of hills that they have. The issue with surviving on the back of a Trilli is that they are capable of submerging, and when they do, can stay down weeks at a time. However, they only submerge when they are hungry. It takes them several days, per hill that they have, to prepare to dive. The process is very obvious to the Feindel, and is the basis for the final phrase, "The Tralee breathes deeply," meaning extreme action must be taken to prevent impending disaster. The Findle will go to great lengths to keep this from happening, of course, up to and including feeding their own people to the Tralee. Mostly this is done with criminals, though occasionally, in their history, it would be done by volunteers or even a lottery if the need became dire. Of note, the Findle are one of the very few species from a low-index world that have a capital punishment, and it only takes one form, to the point that they will ship their criminals all the way across the League to feed them to a Tralee. This dependence on the Tralee is the source of their slavish dedication of the Altan, in two ways. The first is culturally. The birds have a strong cultural bias towards those who protect them, and these Altans have taken a place in their culture alongside the Tralee. The second is gratitude. The Exaltans wiped out the predators which hunted the Findle and opened the land up to their colonization. Now, very few of the Findle who live on their world still live on the backs of Tralee, though living in those communities is now a sought-after social status, and they remember who opened the land to them.
Annabel looked at Vashna with newfound respect and saw that the blush on her hands had faded, despite everyone in the room eyeing her with surprised, but impressed, expressions. I would be blushing furiously under those gazes. She simply sits there with her chin high, a cool gaze, and a slight smile. She isn't preening under the attention either. She gets more impressive with every new thing I learn. No, stop it, man. Everyone looked to Henry, but he had to glance at her again. She smirked and winked, then brushed her hand over the back of his. Henry smiled and nodded.
Thank you for the rundown, Vashna. Clear and concise. I have to admit, I didn't know the part about the breathing and going underwater.
He turned to Galen.
Well, I can see why you wanted to leave news of the Findle till the end. It is always nice to end on a high note. Thank you all for coming and your contributions today. I think we are out of time for now, and should probably get back out there and be seen. That, and I think it will take time for us to digest this news and come up with things we can do with it. I know my intel guys are going to do cartwheels with the data they will expect to get from the Findle upper echelons.
Everyone smiled and made the appropriate gestures as they rose to leave. Annabel remained seated for the moment, content to let everyone else file out first. Vashna managed to brush his hand as she got up, and he felt his hand blush. He saw hers do the same, and his heart froze in his chest. She is trying, really, really trying. She isn't some young woman with stars in her eyes either. She's made that clear enough when she has called me down on my errors in the meetings with Eldia. If she wasn't so young,